The sky above Eidolon 7 burned with streaks of orange and crimson as something small and metallic tore through the planet's atmosphere. A single escape pod, no larger than a family-sized car, tumbled through the sky like a dying star before crashing deep into the dense, shadowy forest below. Trees splintered, dirt erupted into the air, and smoke curled skyward from the ruined vessel. Inside the crumpled pod, Lyra, an Elorian girl, stirred weakly. Her silver-blue skin glowed faintly under the dim emergency lights. Her slender frame was draped in a soft, iridescent cloak that shimmered like moonlight on water. Her large, glassy eyes blinked open, filled with fear and confusion. She could still hear the distant echoes of the battle, the screaming alarms, the shudder of explosions against her mothership, and the desperate orders of her crew. Now, all of that was gone. Silence wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. Survivor protocol. Initiate. A faint robotic voice buzzed from the damaged control panel. Sparks flew as the console short-circuited. Lyra pushed herself upright, biting back a sharp cry of pain. Her left leg throbbed, and a faint bluish liquid oozed from a gash on her calf. With trembling hands, she pressed a small crystal device against the wound. A soft hum filled the air as her alien medical tool sealed the injury temporarily. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling quickly. Her species, the Elorians, were not built for survival in harsh environments. They thrived on balance, peace, and the unique energy fields of their homeworld, none of which existed here on Eidolon 7. Through the cracked viewport of the pod, she could see the alien forest outside. Dark, towering trees loomed over her, their sharp branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Strange glowing insects buzzed around patches of bioluminescent moss. Everything felt hostile. Her stomach clenched painfully. Elorians did not eat food like humans. They fed on energy, a delicate ambient force drawn from the environment or their crystalline energy cores. But here, the energy was faint, almost non-existent. She could feel herself weakening by the minute. Steeling herself, Lyra pushed open the damaged hatch. It screeched in protest, but eventually gave way. The cool night air hit her face, carrying unfamiliar scents. She stumbled out, clutching her side as she surveyed her surroundings. Somewhere out there, she hoped, there would be help, or at least something she could use to survive. Hours passed as she moved cautiously through the dense undergrowth. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl, made her jump. Her vision wavered, and her glowing skin began to dim slightly, a sign that her energy reserves were running dangerously low. Then she felt it, a faint pulse, like a distant heartbeat. Energy. It was warm, vibrant, and impossibly strong. Her eyes widened as she realized where it was coming from. Humans, she whispered in her soft, melodic voice. Her people had strict rules about interacting with humans. They were seen as unpredictable, dangerous, and often destructive. Feeding on a human's energy was not just taboo, it was forbidden. Yet in this moment, her survival instincts screamed louder than her moral teachings. In the distance, faint lights flickered through the trees. A human settlement. Lyra hesitated, clutching a glowing crystal pendant around her neck. She remembered her elders' words. We do not take what is not freely given. To feed on another's essence without consent is to cast away our light. But if she didn't act soon, there would be no light left in her at all. Her trembling legs carried her closer to the edge of the forest. The settlement came into view, a small mining outpost surrounded by high fences and glowing floodlights. Humans bustled about, dressed in rugged uniforms, their faces weary and smudged with dirt. Lyra hid behind a large tree, her glowing eyes peeking out. The energy she felt radiating from them was overwhelming, like standing near the core of a star. It wasn't just their physical energy, it was something deeper. Their determination, their unyielding will to survive, their stubborn hope. Her head spun with hunger and guilt. Could she really do it? Could she take even a tiny fragment of their essence just to keep herself alive? A sharp sound, Something metallic falling made her flinch. One of the humans, a man with salt and pepper hair and a worn lab coat, was staring straight at her. Dr. Elias Grant, though she didn't know his name yet. Their eyes met, his brow furrowed in confusion as he stepped forward cautiously. "Hey, are you?" he began, but Lyra bolted. Panic surged through her as she ran back into the forest, her weakened body stumbling over roots and stones. Behind her, Dr. Grant's voice called out faintly, but she didn't dare stop. Deep in the forest once more, Lyra collapsed against a mossy rock, her breaths shallow. Her eyes closed, and darkness crept into her vision. The last thing she felt before unconsciousness took her was the distant warmth of human energy, so close, yet so impossibly far away. The forest was silent except for the soft hum of bioluminescent insects and the occasional distant howl of an unseen creature. Moonlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting pale silver patterns on the mossy forest floor. Lyra lay curled against the base of a tree, her silver-blue skin dim and her breathing shallow. The faint glow of her energy core, usually vibrant and steady beneath her translucent skin, flickered weakly now. She was starving, not for food, but for energy. Her species, the Elorians, were bound to an invisible current of bioenergy that connected all living things. But on this human planet, the natural energy was scattered and faint, like trying to drink water from a cracked glass. Her sharp hearing picked up faint sounds again, footsteps, cautious and deliberate. Somewhere nearby, Dr. Elias Grant, the human scientist she had seen earlier, was searching for her. "Hello," his voice echoed softly in the dark. "Are you out here? I'm not going to hurt you." Lyra pressed herself against the rough bark of the tree, clutching the glowing crystal pendant around her neck. Its faint light pulsed against her chest, a symbol of home, now impossibly far away. Dr. Grant's voice grew closer. "I saw you, in the clearing. You're hurt, aren't you?" The words were gentle, full of genuine concern. For a brief moment, Lyra's fear eased. Humans were supposed to be dangerous, unpredictable, but this one sounded kind. But kindness wouldn't change her reality. Her body was failing. She could feel her energy core sputtering like a dying flame. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. A twig snapped nearby, and suddenly, they were face to face. Dr. Grant stood just a few feet away, a small flashlight in his hand casting a pale glow across his rugged face. His salt and pepper hair was messy, and his glasses sat crooked on his nose. His brown eyes widened as he took in Lyra's fragile form, her shimmering skin, her glassy eyes, and the faint glow that pulsed from her chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. You're not from here," he said softly. Lyra's lips trembled, and her voice came out as a whisper, her words accented by a melodic tone. "Please, don't come closer." Dr. Grant froze in place, holding up his free hand in a gesture of peace. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. You're injured, aren't you? Let me help." "No, you don't understand." Lyra's voice cracked, and she clutched her chest, where her energy core flickered faintly. "I'm hungry. I can feel it. From you." Dr. Grant's brow furrowed in confusion. "Hungry? What do you mean?" Her glowing eyes filled with tears as she took a shaky breath. "My people, we feed on life essence, energy. But we don't take it from beings like you. It's forbidden." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and heavy. Dr. Grant processed her words carefully, his scientific mind already fitting the pieces together. "You mean my energy, my life force?" Lyra nodded weakly, her glowing skin dimming further. "If I take it, it could harm you. It's not supposed to be this way." Dr. Grant looked at her, a fragile figure trembling in the cold night air, her glow fading like the final embers of a dying fire. His chest tightened with empathy. "Will it kill me?" he asked softly. Lyra shook her head. "Not if I take only a little. But I can't ask you to do that." It's wrong. Dr. Grant took a slow step closer, kneeling down to meet her eye level. Listen to me. If this can keep you alive, then do it. Take what you need. No. Lyra's voice rose in panic, her eyes wide with horror. You don't understand the risk. But Dr. Grant simply smiled. A tired, reassuring smile. I've dedicated my life to understanding alien life forms. If helping you means giving up a little of my energy, then so be it. He extended his hand toward her, palm up. Lyra stared at it, her breathing uneven. With trembling fingers, she reached out and lightly touched his hand. A faint glow sparked where their skin met, a soft pulse of light flowing from his palm into her fingertips. Dr. Grant gasped quietly as a strange warmth drained from him, leaving him slightly dizzy but otherwise unharmed. Lyra's body responded instantly. Her skin brightened, her eyes regained their sharp focus, and the flickering light of her energy core stabilized. She pulled her hand away quickly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Enough. Enough. Dr. Grant slumped slightly against the tree, but managed a weak smile. See, still standing. Lyra stared at him, guilt and gratitude battling in her eyes. You shouldn't have done that. And yet, he said softly, I did, because I couldn't just let you die out here. For the first time since her crash, Lyra allowed herself to believe that maybe not all humans were as dangerous as her people believed. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Dr. Grant nodded, brushing dirt from his lab coat. We'll figure this out. Okay. Together. But even as they shared this fragile moment of trust, neither of them noticed the distant hum of drones scanning the forest. The colony's patrol had picked up faint energy traces, and they were closing in. The forest was quiet again, but an uneasy tension lingered in the air. Lyra sat on a fallen log, her glowing skin now steady, and her energy core humming softly. Despite her relief, the guilt remained heavy in her chest. She had taken from Dr. Grant, the human who had shown her kindness, and she wasn't sure how to repay that debt. Dr. Grant, meanwhile, stood nearby, adjusting his glasses and looking up at the starry sky. His expression was calm, but the lines on his face told of years spent on his own, far from his home world. He had always been curious about life beyond Earth, but meeting Lyra, an alien from another star system, was something he had never expected. Are you sure you're all right? He asked, glancing back at her. You seemed a little off after that. Lyra nodded, though she still felt uneasy. I'm better. Thank you for what you did. I didn't expect it. I told you, I'm not going to let you starve out here, Dr. Grant said with a gentle smile, though his voice held a note of concern. But you need to be careful. If you keep taking too much, it might have a negative effect on you. I know, Lyra said, her eyes darkening. It's forbidden for us to feed from others like this. It goes against everything I've been taught. You've been taught that humans are dangerous, right? Dr. Grant asked, crossing his arms. I get it. My species has a history of being difficult, but not all humans are the same. Lyra's eyes widened slightly at the hint of vulnerability in his voice. She had heard of humans being unpredictable and violent, fierce, driven creatures that often created conflict with those around them. But Dr. Grant seemed different. He didn't look like the type to harm anyone, let alone an injured alien. I didn't think I would meet someone like you, Lyra whispered. You're not like what my people said. Dr. Grant chuckled softly, though there was a hint of sadness behind it. I get that a lot, but not every human is a warrior or a conqueror. Some of us just want to understand, to help. His words resonated deeply with Lyra. She had always felt that her people's way of life was the only correct one, the only peaceful one. But in this strange, chaotic world, she had found someone who valued kindness above conflict, a human who wanted to help rather than destroy. I have to ask, Dr. Grant continued, breaking the silence. What's your story? Where did you come from? How did you end up on this planet? Lyra hesitated for a moment. She had not told him everything. It was hard to explain her situation to someone from a completely different world. But she owed him the truth. "I come from a faraway place," she said slowly, her voice distant. "A planet called Aloria. It's a peaceful world, where my people live in harmony with nature and the energy of the universe. We feed on the life force of our planet. Its energy flows through everything. But we don't take from other intelligent species. It's forbidden." Dr. Grant listened intently, his gaze never leaving her as she spoke. "That sounds incredible. But it also sounds like you're stranded here because your ship crashed." Lyra nodded. "Yes. Our ship was attacked, and we had to escape, but the crash left me alone on this planet. There's no way to contact my people, no way to call for help." Dr. Grant looked at her, his brow furrowed in thought. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. But maybe I can help." Lyra blinked. "You? Help me?" He smiled again, this time with more confidence. "I'm a xenobiologist. I study alien species, and I've been working on researching extraterrestrial life for years. I don't know how I can get you back to your people, but I can help you survive here. Maybe we can even find a way for you to feed without taking from humans." Lyra looked at him, unsure if she should believe him. Could a human really help her? Or was he just saying things out of pity? "I can't promise you anything," Dr. Grant added, his voice soft but firm. "But I can help you find food, shelter, and a way to stay alive." For the first time since the crash, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. This was a fragile chance, and she wasn't sure if she could trust it. But it was a chance nonetheless. "I'll try," she said quietly. "I'll try to trust you." Dr. Grant nodded, his expression serious. "Good. Now let's get you to shelter. The colony patrols are probably looking for you by now." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had nearly forgotten about the humans searching for her. If they found her again, she could be in serious danger. She stood up quickly, her senses alert to any sounds in the distance. "We need to move quickly," she said, her voice steady now. "We can't risk being found." Together, they moved deeper into the forest, away from the settlement. Dr. Grant led the way, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger, while Lyra stayed close behind, her glowing skin dimmed to avoid detection. The night felt heavier now, the weight of her situation pressing down on her with each step. As they made their way through the thick trees, Lyra glanced at Dr. Grant, a feeling of uncertainty still lingering in her chest. He had promised to help her, but could she really trust him? She had no choice but to find out. The forest was dense, dark, and full of hidden dangers. Lyra stayed close to Dr. Grant as they moved deeper into the woods, their steps muffled by the thick underbrush. The trees around them seemed to stretch endlessly, their branches like twisted hands reaching toward the sky. Lyra's glowing skin, once bright and vibrant, now dimmed to a soft, faint shimmer, careful not to attract attention. Dr. Grant led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. Every now and then, he would pause, scanning the environment with a practiced eye, listening for any sounds of movement. His mind was focused, aware of the risks. The colony's drones were likely sweeping the area, searching for signs of the mysterious alien that had crashed onto their world. "We're getting close," Dr. Grant whispered over his shoulder. "There's a small shelter I set up. It's out of the way, hidden enough to avoid being spotted." Lyra nodded, though her thoughts were still tangled with doubt. Could she really trust Dr. Grant? He had shown kindness, yes, but trust was a difficult thing to give, especially when her survival was at stake. She had been taught to keep her distance from humans, to avoid their conflict and their greed. But Dr. Grant was different. He wasn't like the humans her people had warned her about. Yet, even now, she struggled with the fear of what might happen if her presence was discovered. The air grew colder as they walked, the strange sounds of the forest settling into an eerie quiet. Lyra's mind wandered back to the crash, to the moments before everything changed. She had been on a peaceful mission, her ship traveling far from home. The Elorians were explorers, not conquerors, but the attack had been swift, brutal, and without warning. The memories of the destruction still burned in her mind. She had been lucky to escape with her life. As they rounded a bend in the path, Dr. Grant stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal for her to be silent. Lyra's senses heightened, her eyes scanning the surrounding darkness, her ears attuned to the slightest sound. A low hum filled the air, a sound Lyra knew all too well. The colony's drones were nearby, their search for her relentless. "Stay low," Dr. Grant whispered. He pulled her gently into the shadows of a nearby cluster of trees. The two of them crouched in silence, barely daring to breathe as the drone passed overhead. It was a small, sleek craft, floating just above the treetops. Its sensors were scanning the area, looking for any traces of Lyra's presence. The light from its search beam briefly swept over them, but they remained hidden, their bodies pressed against the cool earth. Lyra's heart raced in her chest, her pulse echoing in her ears. The drone moved on, its hum fading into the distance. Only then did Dr. Grant let out a quiet breath of relief. "That was too close," he muttered. "We can't stay in one place for long. The drones are persistent, and they'll keep searching until they find something." Lyra nodded, her body still tense from the encounter. She couldn't afford to be discovered. Not now. Not yet. Dr. Grant motioned for her to follow him, and they resumed their cautious journey through the forest. Minutes turned into hours as they navigated the tangled wilderness. Lyra's legs began to ache from the effort, her body still weak from the strain of surviving without proper nourishment. The small amount of energy she had gained from Dr. Grant earlier was barely enough to sustain her, and it was clear that she would need more soon. Finally, they'd reached their destination, a small hidden clearing tucked away deep in the forest. The shelter was a simple structure, crafted from local materials: branches, leaves, and woven vines. It was barely noticeable, blending seamlessly with the environment. Dr. Grant had clearly put effort into making it as inconspicuous as possible. "This is it," he said, gesturing toward the shelter. "You can rest here. I'll start a fire and gather what we need for the night." Lyra stepped inside cautiously. The interior was small but warm, with a makeshift bed made of soft moss and leaves. A small pile of supplies was stacked near the corner: food rations, a few tools, and a small first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it was a refuge. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Grant smiled, his tired eyes softening. "You're welcome. Rest while you can. We have a lot to figure out tomorrow." Lyra nodded, though sleep wasn't easy to find. Her mind kept racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the humans were closing in on her. The drones were relentless, and the risk of being found was ever present. She also couldn't stop thinking about the forbidden energy she had taken from Dr. Grant. Could she continue to feed on him without consequences? Would he grow weaker the more she took? As Lyra lay on the bed, her body restless, her eyes caught sight of the small crystal pendant around her neck. It had once been a symbol of her people's strength and unity. Now it felt like a reminder of her failure, a reminder of how far she had fallen from the peaceful ideals of Eloria. Meanwhile, outside the shelter, Dr. Grant worked quietly, starting a small fire and preparing for whatever the next day would bring. He had no idea how long this fragile alliance would last, or what dangers would come from his decision to help an alien in need. But one thing was clear: he had made a choice, and now both their fates were intertwined. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty as Lyra and Dr. Grant worked together to survive in the dense forest. They kept to the shadows, moving under the cover of night, never staying in one place for too long. The threat of discovery by the colony's drones loomed over them like a storm cloud, and every rustle in the trees, every distant sound, sent both of them into a state of alert. But there was also something else that weighed heavily on Lyra's mind: the energy she had taken from Dr. Grant. She had never been trained to feed on another sentient being, especially not a human. She knew it was forbidden, But without access to the energy of her homeworld, she had no other choice. Still, the guilt gnawed at her, even as her strength slowly returned. As the days passed, Dr. Grant became more and more focused on finding a solution. He had brought out his equipment, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of a way to contact her people, to send a message or call for help. But so far, nothing had worked. The planet's strange electromagnetic field seemed to block all communications from space. One evening, as Lyra sat near the shelter, watching the sky change from orange to deep purple, Dr. Grant approached with a determined look on his face. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence. "If I can build a makeshift transmitter, something that can bypass the electromagnetic interference, we might be able to send a signal, but it's going to take time and resources. I'll need your help." Lyra looked up at him, her bright blue eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure this is a good idea? The more you work on this, the more you risk drawing attention to us. The drones will find us." Dr. Grant paused, his brow furrowed. "I know the risks, but we can't just sit here and wait for something to happen. You need to get back to your people, and I can't leave you here alone." The sincerity in his voice made Lyra hesitate. She had never met a human like him, so determined to help even when the odds were against them. He was putting his own safety at risk, all for her. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me," Lyra said quietly, the weight of her words heavy in the still air. Dr. Grant smiled, but it was a tired smile. "I've been studying alien life for years. I can't just turn my back when I finally get the chance to help. Besides, you're not alone anymore. I'm here with you." Lyra took a deep breath. She knew he was right. They couldn't just hide forever. They had to take a risk if they were going to get her back to safety. Over the next few days, they worked together, gathering materials and building the transmitter. Dr. Grant used his scientific knowledge to craft a makeshift communication device from pieces of equipment he had on hand, while Lyra used her skills to gather the necessary resources from the forest. Her speed and agility made the work easier, though she still felt a pang of guilt each time she fed on the small amount of energy from Dr. Grant. As they worked, Lyra learned more about the human world. Dr. Grant spoke often of his research, the scientific advancements of Earth, and the human drive to explore and understand the universe. Despite his calm demeanor, it was clear he had a deep passion for knowledge. Lyra found herself fascinated by his stories. In her world, exploration had always been about harmony and balance, but humans were different. They sought to understand the unknown, to push boundaries, and sometimes even conquer it. One evening, as they tested the transmitter, a loud crackling sound came from the device. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "It's working," Dr. Grant exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. "The signal is getting through. It's weak, but it's there. Now all we need is a few more adjustments, and we'll be able to send a message to your people." Lyra could hardly believe it. After everything, they were this close. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread in her chest. What if her people didn't respond? What if they were too far away, or worse, what if they didn't want to help? Her thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Grant looked up at her, a sudden seriousness in his eyes. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low. "The drones are getting more persistent. We've been lucky so far, but they're closing in on our location. If we're going to send that signal, we need to move to a safer spot. We don't have much time." Lyra nodded, her heart racing. It was clear that their window of opportunity was shrinking. If they didn't act fast, everything they had worked for would be in danger. The two of them gathered their things quickly, packing up the transmitter and other supplies. Dr. Grant led the way, his eyes scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. Lyra followed closely behind, her senses on high alert. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Lyra's mind raced. What if they were caught? What if the humans found out she wasn't just some curious alien, but a threat to their world? But despite her fears, she couldn't stop herself from hoping. For the first time in weeks, she felt like there was a chance. a real chance that she could get home. The faint hum of drones grew louder in the distance, and Lyra's pace quickened. They had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to be found now. The forest seemed endless as Dr. Grant and Lyra moved deeper into the dense underbrush, their footsteps light and quick. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of the trees, every distant drone hum, felt like a warning. They had to move faster. The colony's search efforts were getting more intense. Lyra could hear the drones now, closer, faster, almost like they were hunting her. "We need to find cover," Dr. Grant whispered urgently, his voice low but firm. His eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings. "They're getting closer." Lyra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The energy from Dr. Grant that she had taken earlier had kept her going, but it wasn't enough. She could feel her strength waning again. The hunger was creeping back, and the desperation to find a solution gnawed at her. "I'll keep looking for a place," Dr. Grant continued, moving ahead with purpose. "You stay close." Lyra wasn't sure if it was the mounting pressure or the overwhelming feeling of isolation that made her feel so small in this foreign world. She wasn't used to relying on others, especially not a human. Yet here she was, depending on Dr. Grant for everything. He had been her guide, her protector, and her only hope of returning home. "Do you think they'll find us?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Grant paused for a moment, glancing back at her. "I'm not sure. The drones are fast, but they're still limited in what they can sense. If we can reach the old communications tower I found on the map, we might be able to send a stronger signal. But we have to hurry. It's our best chance." Lyra felt a flicker of hope at his words. She didn't know much about Earth's technology, but she understood that the communication tower he mentioned could be their ticket to survival and to reaching her people. But time was slipping away, and they had to reach it before the drones did. As they moved forward, the canopy above them grew denser, casting the forest floor in shadows. The path had become increasingly narrow and difficult to navigate, but Lyra's keen senses helped her avoid the worst obstacles. Her eyes were always darting between the trees, alert for any sign of danger. The faintest movement could mean the difference between life and death now. Then, suddenly, a loud mechanical whir sliced through the still air. Lyra froze, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced at Dr. Grant, whose face had gone pale. "They've spotted us," he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible. The drone was hovering just above them, its searchlights scanning the ground below. Lyra felt her pulse quicken as the beam swept dangerously close to them. The light flashed over her, and she instinctively crouched, trying to blend in with the shadows. But the drone's sensors were too advanced. There was no escaping its watchful gaze. "Run," Dr. Grant hissed, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her forward. They had no choice but to break for it. The drone was fast, and if they didn't move quickly, they would be trapped. They ran through the forest, branches and leaves whipping at their faces. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts raced. The energy she had taken from Dr. Grant wasn't enough to make her faster, to outrun the drone. She needed more. She needed more to survive. Behind them, the drone's whirring grew louder, its searchlight flashing back and forth. Lyra could hear its mechanical hum drawing closer, like a predator on their tail. The ground beneath their feet became uneven, the thick forest floor making it difficult to maintain speed. Lyra stumbled once, but Dr. Grant was there to steady her, his grip tight on her arm. "Keep going," he urged, his voice strained with exertion. With every step, Lyra felt the weight of her situation press down harder. She had never been so far from home, never been so vulnerable. Her people had always taught her that they were above the chaos of other species, that they had learned to live in peace with the universe. But now, faced with the reality of the hunt, she could feel the instincts of survival kicking in. The fear of being captured, the fear of never getting home, it was overwhelming. As they reached a small clearing, Dr. Grant suddenly pulled her to a stop. Lyra's breathing was ragged, her legs burning from the effort. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "There," he said, pointing to a rusted structure barely visible through the trees. The tower. It was a tall, metal frame, twisted and weathered with age, standing almost like a forgotten monument in the middle of the forest. The communications tower. Lyra's heart surged with hope, but she knew they had to move quickly. The drones weren't far behind. "Let's go," Dr. Grant said, leading the way once more. They ran, pushing through the last stretch of forest, their lungs burning from the exertion. The tower was in sight now, and as they neared it, Lyra could see the damage that time had done to the structure. The metal frame was rusted, and the satellite dish on top looked damaged. It was clear the tower hadn't been in use for years, but it was still their best chance. They'd reached the base of the tower, and Dr. Grant immediately began to work on the control panel. Lyra stood guard, her senses stretched to the limit. She could hear the drones getting closer, their whirring growing louder with each passing second. "Come on," Dr. Grant muttered under his breath, working furiously. "Come on." Lyra could feel the weight of the moment. If they didn't succeed now, it might be too late. And then, just as the drones broke through the trees, Dr. Grant's voice rang out, filled with triumph. "I got it." The signal was live. The message was going out. Lyra's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she turned to face the horizon. The drones were closing in fast, their whirring sound growing louder with every passing second. She could see their searchlights cutting through the trees, their lights sweeping across the forest floor, inching closer to where they stood by the tower. But at that moment, she could hear a sound that lifted the weight from her chest, the soft, rhythmic hum of the transmitter. Dr. Grant had done it. The signal was sent. The message was out. "They're going to get it, aren't they?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Dr. Grant didn't answer at first, his hands moving quickly across the control panel of the communication device, double-checking the settings. He was calm, despite the urgent situation. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady. "It's going out now. It's a long shot, but it's the best we can do." Lyra's eyes locked on the trees, watching the drones grow ever closer. The adrenaline pumping through her veins made her feel like she could do anything. But deep down, she knew it wasn't enough to just send the signal. They had to survive long enough to know if the message would be received. "We need to hide," Dr. Grant said, suddenly pulling her away from the tower. "The signal's out. Now we just need to make sure we're not caught before reinforcements come." Lyra nodded, her mind racing. They didn't have much time. She could hear the drones almost on top of them now, their searchlights flashing in every direction. She followed Dr. Grant, who led her toward a small group of thick trees to the right of the tower. They moved quickly, ducking under branches and slipping between the trunks of the trees, hiding in the shadows as the drones hovered closer. "We'll wait here," Dr. Grant whispered as they crouched low to the ground, their bodies pressed against the rough bark. "Just stay quiet." Lyra nodded, her eyes still fixed on the advancing drones. She could see them now, circling the area with precise, methodical movements. They were searching for her exact location. She knew if they found her, there would be no escaping. The drones were relentless. Her thoughts raced as she felt the hunger return, the need for energy, for sustenance. But she had to ignore it. There was no time for that now. She had to focus on surviving, on getting back home. If the signal worked, help would come. But until then, she had to trust in Dr. Grant, in the fragile bond they had built over these long days. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they remained hidden, watching the drones fly past them in search of any signs of movement. The silence between them was deafening, but it was a silence that they needed. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, and she could hear Dr. Grant's breathing beside her, steady and controlled despite the fear they both shared. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the drones began to retreat. Slowly, one by one, They pulled back into the distance. Lyra could barely believe it. Had they truly escaped detection? Dr. Grant let out a long, quiet sigh of relief. He looked over at her, his face pale but hopeful. "We did it. The drones are gone." Lyra exhaled sharply, her body still tense, but she allowed herself a small breath of relief. They had survived. They had sent the message. Now, all they could do was wait. As they cautiously emerged from their hiding spot, the sky above them began to shift, the stars slowly coming into view as the last of the daylight faded. Lyra looked up, her eyes searching the heavens for any sign of a ship, any sign of her people. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked quietly, her voice soft in the still night. Dr. Grant nodded, though his face was filled with uncertainty. "I believe they will. You're not the only one out there, Lyra. I'm sure your people are looking for you, just like I've been looking for a way to help you." Lyra looked at him, feeling a rush of gratitude. He had done so much for her, risked so much to ensure she could survive, and yet he asked for nothing in return. He was truly a different kind of human than she had ever expected. "We should stay close to the tower," Dr. Grant said, his voice firm now that the immediate threat had passed. "It's our best chance. If they're coming, it's better to be near the signal." Lyra nodded in agreement. They walked back to the base of the tower, where the remains of the transmitter were still functioning, faintly blinking with the signal still active. Dr. Grant quickly checked the system once more, making sure it was still sending, still broadcasting. "The signal is strong," he confirmed. "They'll hear it." Lyra felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, this nightmare would finally end. She would return to her people. She would be able to warn them, to show them that not all humans were enemies. Some, like Dr. Grant, could be allies, even in the strangest of circumstances. They sat quietly beneath the tower, waiting for the stars to guide them. Lyra gazed at the sky, her mind filled with thoughts of home, of Eloria, and of the new world she had discovered in Dr. Grant. After so much uncertainty, all they could do now was wait. But deep inside, Lyra knew something had changed. She was no longer just an alien lost in a foreign world. She was a survivor, and with the help of a kind-hearted human, she had found hope again. The end.